Hi, everyone. This is Caitlin Ellsworth, and I'd like to tell you about my visits to the Charles A. Wright Museum of African American History and Ferris State University's Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. I'm really excited about both of these museums just because of the fact I haven't been to the Wright and I don't even know the last time I went to the Wright, but I've never been to Jim Crow Museum. But I've used it in my research because they do a really good job of explaining Jim Crow racist memorabilia. Throughout the presentation, I will be referring to the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, as the community calls it, the Wright, and the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia as Jim Crow. I did speak to Cindy Tite, collections manager, an MLIS person, one of us at the Jim Crow Museum, and Patrina Chapman at the Wright, who is also an MLIS. Disclaimer, throughout this presentation, visuals may contain examples of Jim Crow era racist memorabilia that may be triggering to some. Please proceed according to your comfort. If you are unfamiliar with Jim Crow era racist memorabilia and would like to do some further learning and unlearning, a great place to start is with Dr. David Pilgrim, who is actually the founder of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. And it's entitled Understanding Jim Crow Using Racist Memorabilia to Teach Tolerance and Promote Social Justice. Literally the whole point of his museum is in the title of his book. Both museums really serve the similar populations, but for different reasons. The Wright Museum is a Black or African American history museum focusing on humanizing Black people's and histories in the Americas, specifically America and Detroit, in order to educate patrons. Through programming and events, the Wright is a destination in Detroit. Ferris State University's Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia is a personal archive turned museum. This is not a Black history museum, but services those interested in correctly writing and portraying racist artifacts and the lasting legacies of those artifacts in their research. Jim Crow artifacts are not Black history. They do not belong to Black people. They are part of Jim Crow white history. And so it's not Jim Crow Museum is not a Black history museum, but people would engage with the Jim Crow Museum for similar reasons that they would engage with the Wright. So let's get into the Wright. So this is founded by Dr. Charles H. Wright in 1965 in Detroit, Michigan. Where the building stands right now is not where it originally was, but you got to fundraise to get those monies. The Wright is accountable to paying members, trustees, and the executive board. It is private for the most part. There is no millage that this museum does get, even though Wright, like a 5-minute walk, the DIA and some other institutions are getting millage money. They've been fighting to get millage money, and it's part of one of the problems that the Wright has is fundraising and keeping that huge building afloat. There's 37 full-time staff members, including, excuse me, museum staff and executive staff. The governance structure really does look like a regular non-for-profit executive committee supported by executive staff, serves academics, researchers, family reunions. I've definitely seen family reunions there, K-12 and post-secondary schools. It is a tourist destination, and absolutely Black history buffs are going to go there, but it's also a destination for events as well. Exhibits at the Wright. So there are 7 permanent exhibits at the Wright, and they include And Still I Rise, which showcases the Middle Passage, which, if you're not aware of what the Middle Passage, it is the Atlantic Ocean, basically, or the passage from Africa to the Americas. So when Africans were snatched from Africa, the Middle Passage is that voyage that they would have taken on the ship to America. Detroit performers, really celebrating performing artists from Motor City. The Ring of Genealogy, which is pictured here. So when you first walk into the Wright, you come into this really interesting circular rotunda. And in this rotunda is a mural by Hubert Massey, and he lent his creative talents to the Wright to produce this floor-size installation of the Ford Freedom Rotunda. And this rotunda is really cool because if you stand more in the middle of where that mural is, if you were to look up, there's like this big dome, and then if you speak into it, your voice bounces back to you. So people also like to just come and see that as well. Stories in stained glass, lots of stained glass pictures and windows, beautiful stained glass. And these are to showcase beacons of hope and transformation in African American history and culture. Then they have a exhibit called 44, and that's obviously to pay homage to former President Barack Obama, who was the first Black president. But one of the great things about the Wright is, so they definitely have the exhibits going on. So they're doing traditional archive and museum work. They do a lot of collecting, but it's not necessarily exhibited in the same way, and it's not necessarily accessible to the public in the same way that Jim Crow Museum is. So the Wright's events, this is where the Wright makes its money. This is where the most patrons come in. And so there's huge events going on throughout the whole year for the Wright Museum. On the two pictures on the left, we have the 40th annual African World Festival this July. This World Festival brings in tens of thousands of people coming into either Hart Plaza or to the actual museum. It's been in both places before, and it's really showcasing the African diasporic history of the region, but also the world. It brings food trucks and vendors. It's so much fun to go to. There's lots of artists performing, and it's a way to build community within Detroit. And a way to bring in people from outside of Detroit. Like I'm from Canada, in Windsor. I come over every year for the African World Festival. They also have a really robust programming for Kwanzaa. So during the Christmas or holiday break into the new year, there's 7 days worth of events, lots of stuff for children. One of the things the museum does physically, even in their building, there's specific sections for children to go to. And there's educational programs during spring break. They're doing everything that a museum would and should be doing for children and for those parents. And on the right, you can kind of see a glimpse into And Still We Rise, the permanent exhibits and events that are around them. And this is just a glimpse from September to March. And so you can see specifically just for that permanent exhibit, how many events are going on. This museum prides itself in their programming and events and their permanent exhibit And Still We Rise, which is a really great exhibit to, if you want to go to. It's very a visceral experience because you're actually traveling into the hull of a ship where enslaved Africans would have been unfortunately living in for months while being snatched up from Africa and going to the Americas. So let's look at the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. On your right, that's Dr. David Pilgrim. He is the founder and current director and a professor at Ferris State University, but he's the current EDI specialist at Ferris State, which interesting position, but makes sense that he would be doing it. It was founded in 1996. This was born out of Dr. David Pilgrim's personal collection. He had amassed over 10,000 artifacts of Jim Crow. So gollywogs, mammy figures, jockeys, anything, artifacts in blackface, anything that would go around with and even in the picture, white man and colored man, like those type of signages, he had amassed over 10,000. So he said it wasn't responsible of him to keep that to himself or only to academics who access him. He wanted it to be to the wider population. And so working at Ferris State, he approached the university, and then they said, oh, absolutely, this would be great. So it is a destination, and it sets Ferris State University apart from other universities because no one else has a Jim Crow artifact and archive in this way, and specifically to educate people so social justice can be achieved. Because Ferris State University houses this archive and museum, they are governed by a Senate and Board of Governors, which means that the everyday governance of this museum is taken out of this museum specifically. So they just abide by the governance structure of the university, which means they have more time to do museum work and get out of the politics of everything. Meaning they only have 8 full-time staff, including museum staff and executive staff, and a few volunteers. This museum and archive is really specific. It doesn't necessarily serve the same type of population, but at the same time serving the same population as the Charles H. Wright Museum. But they serve academics, researchers, university and college students, authors, and alumni. It's a little bit more narrow in the focus, just because a lot of this is really tough material to deal with if you're not familiar with it. So archive at the Jim Crow Museum. So at the top, you can see anti-Black imagery. So that is directly off of the website, and you can see a bunch of different types of artifacts. So sugar bowls and advertisement for syrup, mammy statues, Aunt Jemima statues. All of those are racist memorabilia. Soap ads on the right-hand side, those racist memorabilia that David Pilgrim has amassed. And so the objective of the Jim Crow Museum is teaching tolerance with objects of intolerance. The Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia is the nation's largest publicly accessible collection of artifacts of intolerance. The museum contextualizes the dreadful impact of Jim Crow laws and customs. The museum uses objects of tolerance to teach tolerance and promote. The museum uses objects of intolerance to teach tolerance and promote a more just society. The museum is located on the campus of Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. Admission is free for all visitors. So that's a difference. Charles H. Wright does charge a fee. The Jim Crow Museum does not. And one of my favorite aspects of this museum specifically is questions for the museum. So there is a whole page where people just submit questions about Jim Crow artifacts. And one that keeps on popping up quite a bit in my life because it's on social media, it seems like almost every other year or every year and a half, is people asking questions about lawn jockeys. And, you know, people really thinking that it was part of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a clandestine movement. Black people were not going to use these really poignantly mocking artifacts to symbolize stops on the Underground Railroad. But this is what this archive is for, and these people are for, is to educate everyone on this. There's a bunch of different questions. It's so interesting that because Aunt Jemima has been taken off of syrup bottles, there's questions about that lately. There's questions about the Black brute stereotype. These are all really important myths that need to be tackled, but also information that needs to be given. So here is like a compare and contrast of the museums. Both of these museums serve similar patrons, created out of passion projects by founders. There's challenges with buildings. One of the interesting things with the Jim Crow Museum is they are going to be expanding. The university is fundraising to, at the entrance of Ferris State, have a big Jim Crow museum. So you literally cannot go into the university without actually engaging in some way with the Jim Crow Museum. But unfortunately, because of floods and where the space is currently now, there have been artifacts that have been completely destroyed. The Charles H. Wright has also had floods because of the way the structure is, and they've been closed sometimes for weeks at ends. There's funding issues because Charles H. Wright does not get a millage, and so they are really relying on funding from outside sources. And you know, this is an extra thing that that Ferris State University does. So it's not necessarily a focus. So we'll see how this all goes. MLIS and LIS professionals run both museums. Both museums hold some archival collections. Charles H. Wright Museum has permanent and rotating exhibits, while the Jim Crow Museum is like just walls, floor to walls and ceilings of artifacts. There's large building structure, while Jim Crow does not have a large building structure. Charles H. Wright focuses on annual large events like the African World Festival, like Kwanzaa, like the President's Speaker Series, while Jim Crow is really trying to educate about those racist memorabilias. Charles H. Wright has executive committee, board of directors, and trustees govern. Jim Crow gets to kind of they get to do museum work more because they're not worried about the governance structure because they're housed within a university. Both of them are nonprofits, but nonprofits in different way. Universities are nonprofits to a certain extent. Charles H. Wright is a nonprofit independent museum. Charles H. Wright has 37 museum staff and is specifically a Black History museum, while the Jim Crow Museum has 8 employees and is a white Jim Crow history museum. Charles H. Wright they are a staple in Detroit, and Jim Crow is a destination in Big Rapids. Strategic priority for Charles H. Wright is really to educate through exhibits and robust events. And Jim Crow Museum is documenting a specific time frame in North American or American history, and the strategic priority to educate through Jim Crow racist memorabilia exhibits, talks, and archive. I am so happy to have been able to engage with both of these museums. I will be using research from the Jim Crow Museum and will be attending a bunch of different events at Charles H. Wright, and I really hope that all of you do as well. These are just some of the references. All of the images are from the websites unless otherwise stated. It's been my pleasure to engage and teach you about Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History and the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State, the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. Thank you.